It is a joy to officially start digging for scriptural gems with you as we get right into 2 Samuel chapter 1, and today studying the first 10 verses of this great book. I'm Ken Godevanas. Thanks for joining us. Just a little bit of background. Saul had been fighting with the Philistines, or against the Philistines. Meanwhile, while David was a fugitive from Israel, he took up with the Philistines and offered to fight Israel with them. But they rejected his offer to fight for them, not trusting him to change his mind, so they sent him back to one of the cities of the Philistines. He and his men returned to Ziklag to find the Amalekites, while everybody was away, had ruined their houses and taken off with their wives. David goes after them, slaughters them, and brings back all the wives that they had taken, and family members, I would assume. Meanwhile, the Philistines defeat Saul and his army, supposedly killing Saul and his 3 sons. Verse 1 says that after the death of Saul, in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, David, after returning from the slaughter of the Amalekites, remained for 2 days in Ziklag. And then, on the 3rd day, one of Saul's young men, or this could be translated a fighting man or a soldier, with torn clothes and dust on his head, came to David and fell prostrated before him. Now, tearing one's clothes and throwing dirt on one's head were outward expressions of grief in the ancient Near East. This was often a reaction to tragic news, both the receiving and the sharing. When David asked him where he came from, the man replied he had escaped from the camp of Israel, at which point David asked him how things had gone, and he said, people fled, many had died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. David then asked, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead? The young man replied that he by chance was on Mount Gilboa and saw Saul leaning on a spear while the enemy chariots and horsemen were closing in on him. Apparently Saul saw him and called for him and asked him who he was. The man replied, I am an Amalekite. And then, according to his story, Saul asked him to kill him as, and I quote, the agony has seized me because my life still lingers in me, end of quote. The NET says, finish me off. I'm very dizzy, even though I'm still alive. Today we might say, please put me out of my misery. The point of the reference to Saul's dizziness is that he was unable to finish himself off because he was weak and disoriented. Also, the phrase, even though I am still alive, is confusing to most translators, and the consensus is that it is so as Saul himself was uttering words because of his own confusion. Wounded by enemy arrows, and then having tried to kill himself by his own sword, Saul was still alive. And the young man said to David, I killed him because I knew he could not live long in that condition, and I took the crown from his head and the bracelet on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my lord. Now, whether or not a king goes to battle wearing his crown, I'm not going to argue with. I'll accept it for what it says. But it's an interesting point. Okay, we're going to stop there and try to unfold this as we look for some spiritual gems. First of all, we have to deal with some apparent differences in the story of Saul's death that we find here in the first chapter of 2 Samuel as compared to the content of chapter 31, the last chapter, and verse 8 of 1 Samuel, where we're told that the Philistines came upon Saul's body and they cut off his head and took his armor. Now, maybe they left his crown, and maybe they left the bracelet on his arm. Again, I don't know. But which is it? Did the Philistines do this, or did this young man who claims he was an Amalekite do it? We would do well to remember that in their original forms, both 1 and 2 Samuel were continuous in one single document. Remember also that the Amalekites were enemies of Israel. Nevertheless, as the NET edition says, and through their editors point out, the claims that the soldier is making here seem to contradict the story of Saul's death as presented in 1 Samuel 31. In that passage, it appears that Saul took his own life not that he was slain by a passerby who happened on the scene. Some scholars account for the discrepancy by supposing that conflicting accounts have been brought together in the Masoretic text, the MT, the authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic text of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, that is quite common in the Rabbinic Judaism faith. And the editors come to this conclusion, and I quote, "However, it is likely that the young man is here fabricating the account in a self-serving way so as to gain favor with David, or so he supposes. That remains for us to see as we move forward. The fact remains he did have Saul's crown and his bracelet, which he presented to David. Now, for all of the above reasons, I would ask your indulgence, allowing us to spend one more episode on this very passage as we dig into what numerous commentators have to say about the situation. In the meantime, that'll give us a little bit of time for each of us to ponder the differences that we see before us. In the meantime, I would ask that you please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our video studies. As well, please share them, write to us, and keep on studying.